I'll keep pushing it there. Let's ignore that for the moment. That's an oak tree that my father stole from King George VI. But yeah, narratology is dead. I was at the DIGRA conference in Utrecht a couple of weeks ago, this one, and I can tell you after 3 days that the man with his tongue out on everything, that gets really kind of surreal and strange and a bit disturbing. But I was doing something on stage and I mentioned narratology, and someone at the back of the room shouted, "But narratology's dead!" And I was kind of going, well, you're being provocative, or possibly drunk. And looked around, and there was general kind of nodding, people going, but yeah, narratology, and is narratology dead? And I suddenly realised it was an academic audience that I was talking to. And hang on, I can zip forward now, possibly. Yeah. So, yeah, academics don't create stuff, they just react to what is out there at the moment. And from an academic perspective, and I'm not an academic, and was slightly bewildered to find myself at this conference, I have to say, digital storytelling could be perceived as being a bit static. There are no major advances. We're kind of repeating the ground that's already been covered in terms of techniques. There are exceptions to that, Alexis being one of them, but it could be said that digital storytelling is static. Or digital story is static, to put it another way. If you look at Bastion, which I've had several conversations about in the last couple of days, Bastion, the indie game, came on Xbox Live and PlayStation, whatever the PlayStation download thing is. A little isometric game with fantastic voiceover, really amazingly atmospheric voiceover in which the narrator describes your actions and puts them in a context. And it's wonderful for the first couple of hours, and then you realise that actually the story of the game is just the same old video game nonsense. You're in a slightly futuristic, slightly odd place with weird weapons, and you're going to have to kill a lot of stuff, and there was a war and there have been repercussions, and none of the characters has more than 2 dimensions, one most of them. And it's just, it was the same story in a new wrapping. It was business as usual. So now I'm being provocative. Story games. Story games are combine my 2 favourite things on earth. Story and games. But the thing about interactive stories is that it's a completely, the fact that stories have become interactive, the fact that game stories are interactive, this is the game changer for me. It's not a simple advancement like from theatre to cinema. It's a complete rejigging of the whole storytelling dynamic. The fact the stories are interactive, that you are a participant within the story, changes the way you perceive the story and the actions of the story, not just through the way it's told, but also the events itself and the sequences that that you'll be going through. And this, for me, says that games should be demanding new stories. We're still, at the moment, telling old stories in using new methods, the medium of games. And I have enormous respect for Namaste and for people like Chris Crawford and his Storytron, if you're familiar with that. Systems for telling for telling stories through games. But I don't believe, from what I've read, that either of them really playing through the medium's strengths yet, to the medium of interactivity, to the medium of actual participation in a story, and the potential to shape the story from within. I'm sorry, this is... can you just give me 30 seconds?
Sure. And by the way, people on Twitter have commented the fact that I failed to mention that James wrote Sonic the Hedgehog Choose Your Own Adventure books, which apparently are great. Yes, someone there are fans in the audience.
Oh God, my past haunts me. I wrote 2 Sonic the Hedgehog novels as well under a pseudonym. I thought about mentioning them at some point. I thought about dissing transmedia, which is supposed to be the new great hope of digital storytelling, and going, this is nothing new, and showing Sonic the Hedgehog novels. And I have to say, novelising Sonic the Hedgehog is a pretty thankless task. But what we've got at the moment is essentially we've got old stories being told in short bursts, usually interrupted by sporadic gunfire. And I apologise, I'm slightly flaking, I'm rather short of sleep, but it is hard to explain why interactive fiction, interactive storytelling through the medium of games, is so radically different, because to a very large extent we haven't developed a vocabulary to explain it. We don't have, as a field, we do not have yet a critical vocabulary for story in game. This is something I'll be coming back to. So I figured it's probably worth looking at how other games deal with interactive storytelling, or have done in the past. And let's go back to the beginning. The first story game I ever encountered, this one. That is a legend. That's Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, first edition, 1981 I came across that. I think it actually started coming out in 1978. They released the books in subsequent years, which was kind of difficult because you do need all three to play the game. But I loved this game. This game quite literally changed my life, quite possibly saved my life. I had a hellish experience at school. 5 years after discovering that, I took the Guinness World Record for endurance Dungeons & Dragons play with a group of others. We did 84 hours without sleep to Guinness conditions, and raised money for charity, which was the point. Then, 18 years after I discovered that, I actually finally had my first role-playing game published, and it's this. That is The Extraordinary Adventures of Baron Munchausen. That's 512 pages of charts and tables and rules and structure for, it doesn't describe the background world at no point. There is no background to that. It's a generic fantasy world, except it's not generic because the nature of the world is specified by the structure of the rules. And it's a world of classes and levels and experience points and all these tropes that we now know so well. This is 24 pages. Actually, to be honest, it's about a page and a half of rules and the rest is padding because you can't sell a page and a half of rules. And then a couple of weeks ago, I wrote another game, and it's here. It's on the back of my business card, and that is another role-playing game. There you go, 4 paragraphs. So we've gone from, Dungeons & Dragons started in 1974, we're now a scarily long time ahead of that. But we've gone from 512 pages to 4 paragraphs. And that's not Dungeons & Dragons, it's not the same game, but it's recognisably a descendant of what's in those 3 big books. So, how has tabletop role-playing undergone this amazing process of miniaturization, whereas by contrast, video games seem to have got, many of them got bigger and bigger and more bloated. As has been noted, they're kind of coming down in size, but they're still not 4 paragraphs. And if you actually look at the history of tabletop role-playing games and video games, there are considerable parallels. 1974, 1975. D&D comes out in 1974, 1975, Colossal Cave. The first text adventure, still probably the classic definitive text adventure. If you've not played it, you really should. It's still fun. It's a little bit primitive, but the writing's there. And both of these are games that are about words. They take place in the imagination because all the description is, it's either in written text or it's in spoken word. So the pictures are in your head, the action is in your head, the voices of the characters are in your head. And things continue kind of on this level for quite a while. We head into the 80s, graphics begin to come in an increasing way as computers become more powerful. And indeed, as printing becomes better and role-playing game publishers discover they can afford decent artists as opposed to the kind of people who draw something like that. And it gets more and more graphical until we hit 0 Hour, which is somewhere in the middle of 1992, where there are 2 almost simultaneous releases. In the tabletop field, we get Magic: The Gathering, and on the digital field, we get Wolfenstein 3D. And both worlds simultaneously change forever. Magic: The Gathering, you know how successful it is, how much it's influenced. Everything changed in the games field at that point. It became about artwork on cards, it became about pure gameplay. Story was still in there. It was still important to have some vestiges. All the cards had colour text on them to say a little about who they were and kind of how they worked together. And later Magic expansions had story arcs, and I still don't understand exactly how that works. Wolfenstein, again, it's the background, but the game is shooting Nazis. And of course Doom is then shooting demons, and it becomes about the gameplay. And then very quickly CDs come in, and you can do more graphics and more sound and more sophisticated graphics. And it becomes about what the game looks like. Not entirely, I'm not saying that tabletop roleplay or old-style gaming disappeared overnight, but this was absolutely the harbinger of kind of where we are today. And yet, in tabletop roleplay, in the last few years, there's been an explosion of what are being referred to as indie RPGs. I claim, perhaps disingenuously, that this was the first one. This was 1998. But from about the year 2000, 2001, there was a huge swell of self-published little RPGs that broke the rules. They were not trying to ape Dungeons & Dragons. They were not, here is your character generation system, here is your combat system, here is your experience point system, here's some background, here's a sample adventure. They went beyond that. They explored storytelling techniques. They allowed the players to participate in the storytelling, whereas most post-D&D games, and D&D itself, obviously, follow fairly slavishly this paradigm of having a games master who knows the story and is telling it piecemeal to the players in very much the way that a lot of video games do. You play some of the game, and then the game gives you a bit of story, and you either sit through it or you go and make a cup of tea while the cutscene runs. Or go and have lunch in the case of Metal Gear Solid. And these are games like Sorcerer, which is a game about enslaving demons, and you're a wizard who enslaves demons. Dogs in the Vineyard, which is set in the Old West. You're a bunch of essentially mercenaries or vigilantes, kind of freelance exorcists, really. You are, I think, I'm not sure if it explicitly says you're Mormons, but you're sorting out religious problems in the Old West. It's a fantastic game. Sweet Agatha, which is essentially, can be played solo. A girl you knew disappeared, and it's just an envelope of kind of evidence and what happened. And Fiasco, which, do I have the slide here? I do. Fiasco came out last year, has won more awards than I can count. Fiasco is essentially the game of a Coen Brothers caper movie. One of those little movies where a bunch of inept crooks pull off a crime, and then it all goes horribly wrong, and they start fighting among the group, and some of them inevitably end up dead or worse. And there is no games master in Fiasco. You all have equal control over the story, and it's a bunch of very simple little mechanics giving rise to some very complex narrative systems. It's beautifully elegant. Its layout and writing is a joy. I recommend that you check it out. And these are collaborative story games. They are mechanics light, they have very clever structures. And part of the reason that indie RPGs came through in such a big way, in such a massive wave, is because they do have a great critical vocabulary. There are many, many forums online where people discuss design tropes, they critique each other's work, they playtest each other's games and give feedback. There are regular competitions for design stuff. It's an amazing collaborative environment. And a lot of that critical vocabulary is feeding through into the much wider games world. Phrases like GNS, Gamist, Narrativist, Simulationist, which you may have come across, that came out of tabletop roleplay originally, came off of a forum called The Forge, which sadly no longer exists, run by Ron Edwards, who probably has more of a legitimate claim to being the founder of the indie games movement than I do. But yeah, so the Gygax Einarson stuff is kind of analogous to the majority of digital storytelling. It's the game knows the story, and if you do the right stuff, it'll tell you a bit more. And that's how you progress. Game, bit of story, bit of game, bit of story. Whereas these, the new stuff, are essentially meta systems for procedurally generating stories and using the style of the game to create the storytelling style as well. This, I said, page and a half of rules, the rest is padding. No, the rest is atmosphere. The rest tells you the style in which you are supposed to play the game. If If you just read the rules, you won't be able to play it. You won't get how it works. You read the rest of it. And the game is written, incidentally, by Baron Munchausen himself, who turns out not to really be a great games designer. He's very digressive and keeps telling you about his amazing adventures, which is what the game's about. But that gives you the atmosphere, that gives you the style, that gives you the narrative voice in which to play the game. So, a phrase I will come back to once many times during this: simple rules giving rise to complex narrative structures. Let's call these story bites. Let's call them, for the sake of argument, acorns. Stuff that you can pick up or ignore, but if you plant it, it may grow. So, can we take a leaf out of the books of tabletop roleplay and apply that to the more digital arena? Can we stop thinking of stories as a preset collection of narrative tropes in a preset order with preset characters and expensive voiceover work, and instead come up with new ways of telling stories that play to the strengths of the interactive platform, allow people to, if not create their own stories, then at least modify their own stories, take a greater part in the telling of the stories instead of sitting there and listening to voices or running around to see if you can jump on that console while a bunch of people explain the next bit of plot to you. And really, what am I talking about? What potential am I talking about? What specifically do I want? Do I want procedurally generated stories in the same way that Minecraft procedurally generates a world out of cubes? Can we apply the same things to stories? I don't know. I'm not here to prescribe the next step in interactive storytelling to you. I'm here to say it's possible that we can move forward, that it's possible there's an entire area that we're just not looking at because people are going, oh, well, it's not commercial, no one's really doing that. No one was doing what Alexis is doing now, and he seems to be doing perfectly fine out of it. And one of the advantages of this, one of the advantages of the acorn metaphor that I'm going to keep beating over the head, I'm afraid, is that you can plant these things around, little kind of gems of story, bits of story that one can look at and find in the world and explore if you want to, or if you're the sort of guy who just has you just want to skip the cutscene and get on to more shooting, you don't have to participate in the story stuff at all. I keep hearing the complaint, there's too much story in my game. I find that bizarre because, as I said, for me, story and game go together like whiskey and ice cream. But there are people out there who just want to do the shooting. They just want to get online and kill their buddies. And one of the things that Alexis mentioned was imagination. Building in imagination, building in the player's imagination into the storytelling process. This is what I want to explore. This is what I want to explore as a possibility in the digital arena. And you guess you can do it by giving them less. And Alexis's stuff is text-based. It inherently engages the imagination. It forces you to pull up your own mental images for stuff. Can we, in a visually dominated medium, also engage the player's imagination? Can we force them to make up their own bits of story, to make up their own plots from the elements that we give them? Because the brain is a natural story processor. Like your PlayStation 3 has graphics processors. We have the story processor in here. We are pre-programmed to see a bunch of disparate elements and make a narrative out of them. And that gives us everything from Beowulf right up to conspiracy theories and Obama's trying to poison everyone in Idaho because I don't know why, but there are people who believe this stuff because they wrote 3 separate news stories and picked up links that no one else has ever seen. We do that. We can't help doing that. And it's fun doing that. So how do we begin to explore building imagination into digital games, building new forms of storytelling? What structures do we need? What processes do we need to start thinking about? What foundations can we lay? The metastructure. Trust your metastructures. At this point I discover I've missed 2 or 3 slides along the way. No, I haven't. The hero's journey. I'm sure you're all familiar with the hero's journey. It's quite literally as old as the hills. Joseph Campbell's principle of the hero going out and facing adversity and coming home. It's Star Wars, it's The Matrix, it's a large number of video games. It is amazingly robust as a storytelling structure. It's not the only one. There's Save the Cat, which is a fantastic book on writing screenplays. I recommend it very, very highly. Blake Snyder sadly died a couple of years ago, very young. It's a wonderfully funny delightful book about writing a beat sheet for a story, emotional peaks, emotional troughs. He doesn't prescribe, he doesn't say this is how a story has to go. He goes, this is how a story can go. So you understand the meta structure of your story before you start putting the story stuff into it. Beat sheets generally. Robin Laws, I don't have a cover for it, the tabletop RPG designer, has recently put out a book called Hamlet's Hit Points, which is dissecting classic drama in terms of their emotional beats and talking about applying that to an interactive space. He's a tabletop designer, he's talking about the tabletop experience, but there are massive applications to doing that in digital games as well. If you give people a context, which is essentially what the meta story is, that the brain will do the rest. You give them the elements along the way, they will understand how the elements fit into the meta story. And storytelling, the technique of how the story is told, is as important, sometimes more important than the story itself. If you look at Half-Life 2, which has been hailed by many people I used to respect as a triumph of story in game, it isn't. Gordon Freeman is an idiot, fundamentally. He's a research physicist who decides to take on the world with a crowbar. Well, he ought to be locked up for that. He single-handedly decides to, halfway through Half-Life 2, my friend has been locked up in the most secure prison there is. I will single-handedly break him out. Why? Well, it's not really explained why we need him out, but I'm going to break him out. And conveniently, along the way to the prison, Gordon runs into a whole tribe of alien giant insects that he conveniently learns how to control, and that's the only reason he's actually able to make the prison break work. He's an idiot. There are entire sections of Half-Life 2 that add absolutely nothing to the story. The Raven Home. Has everyone played Half-Life 2? Is everyone aware of it? Raven Home, the town entirely populated by zombies, has no narrative purpose. It's just in there because it's kind of fun killing zombies. You get to fire saw blades at them, it's awesome. And it's fun, and games are meant to be fun, but in terms of the story, it's a distraction. In terms of the storytelling, it heightens the tension. There's an interesting NPC who really ought to do a lot more with, the mad priest. And I kept expecting him to either make a big revelation or give me something to do, and he doesn't. He just kind of runs around and kills a few zombies with you. He's a completely wasted opportunity, but it's fun, and it feels tense. And the amount of Deus Ex Machina in Half-Life 2, things that conveniently happen at exactly the right moment. In a typical story, a typical novel, a screenplay, you can get away with one mad coincidence. Mad, whoa, what are the odds of that happening? Half-Life 2, I think, has one pretty much every act. But the point of view storytelling, the bit of being in Gordon Freeman's head is fantastic. And it works so well that you ignore, in fact, you don't ignore it, you don't notice that the story is rubbish. So, metastructures. Other ways of doing metastructure, other ways of doing kind of story acorns and stuff like that. There's a woman in the UK, Mary Hamilton. She actually works for The Guardian, but in her spare time she runs zombie LARPs. Little kind of they're not even one day, they're like 1 hour, 2 hour LARPs. They'll run multiple ones in an afternoon. And it's zombies versus guys with Nerf weapons. Little different scenarios. There's no major story arc here. The two things that she does that's really interesting is her zombies are programmable. They have different behaviors depending on the scenario. And you're never quite sure going in exactly what the zombie behaviors are going to be. And these are very, very simple things like zombies like doorways. Zombies tend to congregate in doorways. If you are a zombie and you see a doorway, you will probably move towards it. Or zombies like the dark. Or zombies don't like the dark. And this creates enough emergent behavior that it creates within the players, trying to work out what the hell the zombies are doing this time. An emergent narrative. The narrative doesn't come out as you're playing the LARP, because you're trying to run away from zombies mostly, or shoot them. It comes out at the end. Mary's reinvented a principle that I first came across in business and educational simulation games, the debrief, where you sit down after the game and you think about, well, what did we learn here? And Mary's group sit down and they go, well, what stories came out of that? What were the cool bits that happened? You sit down and you reflect over the adrenaline pumping hour, 2 hours that you've just had, and you go, that was fantastic. That bit where Jake dived through and then the thing fell and he jumped and whoa, that was great. And that's what creates the narrative and that's what creates the memories. The Extraordinary Adventures of Baron Munchausen has an interesting metastructure. For those who don't know it, it's a game of 5 minutes. Oh God, I'm going to have to speed up. I won't tell you how that plays. I challenge someone. I challenge Alexis to tell a story. Tell me, Alexis, the time you the story of the time you accidentally impregnated the Pope. Alexis literally has to start telling the story at that point. I can interrupt him with objections to what he's doing. I can just make shit up and go, you say you were riding a giraffe. It's well known that giraffes have a weight limit of 30 kilos. And you can either pick this up and build it into your stories and go, yes, but I was suspended from a helium balloon at the time. Or you can reject it and throw it back at me. What this does is twofold. It gives you a brief moment to think about what you're going to say next, but it also gives you a possible handhold for you to build into your story. It sounds like the objections are going to make your life harder. Actually, they make it easy. Your players are collaborating on building the story with you, but it feels like it's your story. That's the metastructure of Munchausen. Once Upon a Time. Oh, that's the Extraordinary Adventures of Baron Munchausen. Once Upon a Time, the card game, I would wave a copy around, I'm running out of time. The interesting card is the one at the right-hand side. That's the ending card. Once upon a time, you're working collaboratively to all tell the same fairy tale using cards in your hand. You can interrupt each other again, but each of you has a different ending card. You're trying to steer the story around to that, play out all the cards in your hand, play your ending card. And the first person to do that wins. Give your players a destination. Ideally, give them two. Give them a short-term destination and a long-term destination. Give them goals. Let them know why they're doing this stuff and what they're trying to achieve. And if that's preset, the stories that come out of Once Upon a Time are not good stories. They are mostly gibberish, but they are enormously entertaining to play. And this is why this game is 20 years old now. And we're coming to a third edition. They're working on a third edition at the moment. If you give people a destination, they will accept what comes along the way and build it into the story and enjoy it on that level. Story archetypes. Archetypes. The game, Once Upon a Time, is based on. Story archetypes are very important. Use strong archetypes. Characters, incidents that people can immediately recognize. Character in the middle, we know Mario, or Jumpman, we know Kong. Who's that in the middle? Does anyone know her name? Didn't think so. She's Pauline. Actually, in the Japanese original, she was Lady. That is not a strong archetype. You don't play that game to rescue Pauline. You do it because you're beating a fucking great gorilla. But all you have to do is add one word, and suddenly it's all about that almost graphically identical female character. You call her a princess. Princess Peach, and the whole game, the whole next game, Super Mario Brothers, is about rescuing the princess. The whole rescuing the princess trope is now one of the great tropes of video game storytelling. Skip stuff. Obviously, we're going to need dialogue. I'm going to skip a whole section here, which is a bit of a shame because it was the stuff that was the genesis of the talk. I was going to talk about how you could get digital characters to do improvisational drama, and I can sum it up essentially in one word, in one sentence. Read this book. It is the best book about game design ever written. It doesn't mention game design at any point. It is one of the best best books about writing novels ever written. It doesn't mention novels. Keith Johnson was a playwright. He pretty much invented what we now know as theatre sports, improvisational drama as a game.
If you want another couple of minutes.
No, that's great. I'll skip over this stuff. His stuff on status is unbelievably good. Games should implement status. Sod levels, status. And I'm British, I come from the most status-driven society in the world. But understanding where we stand in relation to people in a pecking order. There is a human pecking order, we do it all the time. It's not just humans, it transcends the animal kingdom as well. I'll give you a moment or two to read that. And this stuff is really easy to implement. It's basic body language, it's just stuff that we only notice subliminally. You can build it into games and your players will notice it only subliminally, and they'll suddenly go, no, hang on, why is this character being superior to me? I don't get it. Or you do get it. Fantastic little story tropes, very simple. Johnston, absolute genius. I recommend that book without hesitation. But games are a vocabulary. I said that before. Games are a language. We speak that language. we are fluent in it, and we forget that other people aren't. We forget that we hand people an Xbox controller and say, hey, try this game. Xbox controller has 17 buttons on it. A flute has 16. You wouldn't hand someone a flute and go, Marriage of Figaro, give it a shot. So games have a language, we speak it, many people don't. Game stories don't yet have much of a critical vocabulary. And I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of story development is flat. We are not really building on each other's work, because it's very difficult to analyse each other's work because it's all hidden under the bonnet. It's all in code that we can't look at. Tabletop roleplay, it's there, it's front and centre, it's on the page. Very easy to look at. There are, I would say, no real definitive works on story and game. I wasn't aware of your work up to now, sir, which tends to imply that it's not the definitive work on the subject. I apologise, I will read it. Chris Crawford is good as far as he goes, but then he disappears into the Storytron about halfway through. The Storytron is a fantastic folly. If you want to see what a digital folly looks like, look at the Storytron. Compare that to comics, where you've got Will Eisner's Comics and Sequential Art, Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. Amazing works by creatives at the very peak of their powers, defining how to use an art form and where the art form can go from there. Companies build their own knowledge bases, but they come up with their own terminology for story stuff. Alexis, the Lonely Magpie's asthma inhaler, or whatever it was. But this stuff's proprietary. It tends to live within that company culture, and then people move on and they forget it, or they don't take the full data with them. Games have traditionally, I talked about games academics, they've borrowed stuff from art criticism, they've borrowed stuff from English literature, from film analysis, but this is all based on old media. This is using the critical languages of old media to criticize a fundamentally new medium. And I think that may, again, be one of the reasons that we're getting trapped in telling old stories. So, I'm going to skip past the bit I did on what the hell is a magic circle. This is a phrase that turns up too much. It has 4 competing definitions, including a trade body for professional magicians. So I and a friend sat down and we said, we need a critical vocabulary, we need a place where we can discuss story in game, and we did this. This is Interactive Fantasy. This is a magazine specifically about story and games. Games that make stories, stories that tell games. And we got some of the top creatives in the games industry to write for us. Richard Bartle described it as the intelligentsia of games, and they go into a depth you simply never, ever see elsewhere. And if you notice I'm using the past tense about this, this is because this was 1994. And it was primarily about tabletop roleplay. And I believe, and I have some evidence for the fact that this led on to the genesis of what became the Forge and the indie role-playing game explosion. It was way ahead of its time. We couldn't get proper distribution for it because nobody thought that discussing story in game was really an interesting thing at that point, and we couldn't publicize by the internet because it was 1994 and not enough people had the internet. But we think the time is right for a bit of a resurgence. So first of all, I've spent a lot of time, and anyone who's dealt with old PageMaker files knows exactly how much time that would be, digitizing the issues. And as soon as I can get some decent Wi-Fi, they are finally finished. They are now downloadable as free PDFs. So you can see what the state of the art was like in 1984. And it is interesting. We were the first people to publish Greg Kostikian's essay, I Have No Words and I Must Design, which is now a seminal text for anyone studying game design. But the other thing is, we're bringing it back. We're doing it again. Interactive fantasy is becoming interactive stories. In 1994, it was if we can do this, if we can make this medium work. The potential is there now, the technology is there, the will is there, so this is going to be we are there, we can do this. Interactive stories will be 3 times a year, it will be a free downloadable PDF journal, print copies will cost money, we're looking for sponsorship, we're looking for advertisers, we are putting together an editorial board, we are putting together writers' guidelines. Don't go to the URL, there's nothing there yet, they're still processing the domain, the Spanish are a bit odd about that. But there is a lot more to come. So, very briefly, I'm aware I'm over time. This is the oak tree that my father stole from King George VI. He didn't steal an oak tree, he stole an acorn from Windsor Great Park. They found a tiny acorn that was sprouting, took it to the new house in Kent, planted it. That's what a 70-year-old oak tree looks like. Quercus Wallis's Volant Rex, there's a little plaque on the bottom, the oak tree that the Wallaces stole from the king. Steal an acorn, find an idea, find one lying on the ground, do something with it, see if it bears fruit. If it does, and someone else steals one of your acorns, don't mind, let them go with it. And bring us your acorns over Interactive Stories, because we're going to plant them and we're going to grow a forest. Thank you very much.